Negotiators from Russia and Ukraine are in Istanbul for peace talks, the first direct contact between the warring parties since the early days of the war. The U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has downplayed expectations, saying the only way for progress is for Presidents Trump and Putin to meet face to face. The Russian leader has spurred the challenge by his Ukrainian adversary to turn up for the talks, sending a lower level delegation instead. President Trump is also not going to Turkey, though he has said he might if there's progress in negotiations. The meeting was to have taken place yesterday, but has been delayed amid the uncertainty. It will now take place today, apparently mediated by host Turkey. And for more insight on the latest developments, let's speak now with William Courtney. He is adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation. Mr. Courtney is also a former U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan, Georgia, and was on the U.S.-Soviet Commission, which implemented the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. And he joins us live now from Washington, D.C. Ambassador Courtney, thank you very much for joining us on the show today. So Marco Rubio pulled out of talks and is echoing his boss, saying that the American and Russian leaders need to meet face-to-face to achieve a breakthrough. Is that your reading of the situation as well, that nothing's going to happen until they actually meet?
Nothing appears as if it's going to happen, primarily because Russia shows no interest in serious negotiations. President Trump proposed a 30-day ceasefire, which President Zelenskyy accepted. President Trump proposed a critical minerals agreement, which President Zelenskyy accepted. But then President Putin refused to do the 30-day ceasefire and instead adopted a stalling tactic of calling for negotiations on a larger, more complicated peace agreement. And then he combined that with sending a low-level delegation to Istanbul. So it's pretty clear that President Putin is not interested in a serious negotiation.
Would you say then that Vladimir Putin's ultimate plan is to force a meeting with President Putin, given the fact that, President Trump, I beg your pardon, given the fact that he's already, the US president, he's already met Volodymyr Zelenskyy at least twice face-to-face, never mind the circumstances?
Well, high-level meetings typically are not productive unless they are well prepared with lower-level diplomatic activity, activity which reaches agreement on some points and leaving open for senior leaders other points. There have been no level negotiations. There are no agreements on any aspect of a peace treaty with Russia. So a high-level meeting, a presidential-level meeting, might be risky in the sense that it may not be very productive.
So Ambassador, does that mean that the talks, which are scheduled to take place later today, may actually be fruitful along those lines, meaning they talk about something concrete? Because Marco Rubio, as we know, is already talking about timelines, suggesting that it's not a question of, if, but it's a question really of when that the two leaders are going to meet.
If the Russians had sent Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who's a serious diplomat, to Istanbul to deal with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, that could have been a sign that Russia wanted to start clearing some of the underbrush to get some agreements on certain aspects. But instead, President Putin sent Zelenskyy, who is really a high-class propagandist, but is not somebody who is taken seriously in the diplomatic context.
So, Ambassador, I'm wondering where this leaves Vladimir Zelenskyy. He showed up, he said, basically, I'm ready to talk to you, Vladimir Putin. Has his position been weakened in some way, or do you think he still, at this point, perhaps holds a little bit of advantage, having said, I'm ready to talk, I'm ready to have a ceasefire, as suggested by the United States, 30 days without preconditions?
So President Zelenskyy was clever. He called Putin on his bluff. He accepted the 30-day ceasefire. He traveled to Turkey for a meeting with President Putin, if Putin were willing to go there. Putin was not. So this has left President Zelenskyy in a stronger position in terms of his reputation in the West. And we saw just a couple of days ago, the Chancellor of Germany, President of France, Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Poland were in Kiev expressing support for Zelenskyy's approach and threatening greater sanctions on Russia if Russia did not make a serious effort in peace negotiations. So the Ukrainian position is strengthening as a result of the clever Zelenskyy policy and the willingness of the Europeans to stand up and put more pressure on Russia.
And Ambassador, do you have a sense of how Donald Trump might handle Vladimir Putin's demands? I mean, there are a number of issues and demands on territory, near total disarmament of Ukraine, and also a suspension of all military aid to Kyiv. Is Donald Trump, going to accept some of these positions, given the fact that they are going to substantially weaken Ukraine's sovereignty and as well as position?
Well, the United States and its European allies would have to consider these issues together. Remember, Europe is providing more assistance to Ukraine than the United States is at this point. A number of the past Russian proposals about demilitarization of Ukraine, about not accepting any Western military aid, about changing the government, getting at what Putin calls disingenuously the roots of the problem. Those proposals have no possibility of success in negotiation. Unless Russia moves away from those positions, there's really no hope for negotiation anytime soon. And we see nothing on the battlefield now indicating that Russia is interested. Russia is continuing to attack civilian targets relentlessly with drones and missiles.
Ambassador, President Trump has at times, shown frustration or expressed frustration with Putin, but by and large, it appears that he's, willing to give Putin some latitude, despite all those delays and the rejection of peace proposals and talks. But if Trump, really gets frustrated enough, I mean, what tools does he have to increase the pressure and also signal his displeasure?
Well, the tools that are available are primarily sanctions, and the Europeans have talked about this and raised some ideas, including secondary sanctions, tougher sanctions on the purchasers of oil and gas from Russia. So there's not an absence of tools. Senator Lindsey Graham, a close ally of President Trump, has put together a bipartisan consensus in the U.S. Senate to toughen sanctions on Russia if Russia does not show seriousness in negotiations. So the sanctions tools are available, and the Europeans are really making pretty strong threats to Russia that they're going to increase sanctions unless Russia negotiates more seriously. So I think President Trump and the Europeans together will have to work out a common strategy.
All right, Ambassador Courtney, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you so much for talking to us on the show today. William Courtney is adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation.